We made this.
Hello and welcome back everyone to Blair Witch Minute, a podcast looking at 1999's seminal found footage horror movie, The Blair Witch Project, 1 minute at a time. I'm your host, Tony Black, and this minute begins at 0. 0, 0, 0, zeros across the board as the movie begins and we see the Lionsgate logo, and ends at 0 minutes 59 seconds with the first glimpse of Heather Donahue, one of our main characters. And to discuss this first minute of the movie, I'm once again joined by my guest, Mike Jozic. Mike, it's great to have you here for the first official Blair Witch Minute.
Ahoy hoy. It's good. It's good to be here.
Obviously, we gave people a little bit of a taste with our intro as to the movie and everything like that. But the thing is with this one, there's not a lot to talk about because you really have this first minute, which is a couple of logos, and then I suppose that the key thing, which is the legend at the beginning, quite a famous legend, and we will get into that a little bit.
It is a pretty low-key minute, yeah.
But yeah, that's not really. And the thing is, the film does move at quite a clip because it's only like about 80 minutes long. So the first 5 minutes are packed with stuff that are going on after this. That as the characters, when you start to get to know the characters, and they just start to move around on their journey. But this first minute is just, establishing the production companies. But I think it does sort of give you a sense of that this film is going to be. Well, I suppose you get retrospectively now when you watch it, you get the Lionsgate logo and the music and things like that. But then when it goes on to like Haxan Films, and then you just have the title come up in this very basic sort of type. There's no music. It's not trying to immerse you into like a horror movie, like, dun, dun, dun kind of music or anything like that. It's just silent, really. So I don't know. I mean, does it immediately create a sense of mood when you start this?
I think so. I also think it's mildly telling. You say the Lionsgate logo is before sort of the first title card, because that originally, like when the DVD first came out, it was Artisan. And there was an Artisan logo before it, so you have a newer version.
Did you watch the old? Because I remember the Artisan Entertainment. Yeah, are you following the older DVD?
Yeah, that was the one that I picked up originally. So
yeah,
but yeah,
because that had the Curse of the Blair Witch on it, I think, didn't it? I think I had that DVD, and that was where I saw that because I didn't watch it on. I think it was the Sci-Fi Channel.
I think it was, yeah.
But yeah, that was a good DVD. That was. It didn't. The Blu-ray's got a bit more stuff on it, but that was a good DVD.
It's weird. I mean, it's weird to think of this movie on Blu-ray, considering it's sort of like original level of fidelity. But
yeah, it's not really going to bring out a lot, is it? I guess.
I agree. The original, like the opening with the title card, no music, just this really plain kind of like high contrast black white. It's no nonsense. It kind of tells you right off the bat what the film is going to be like. It's not trying to woo you or regale you. There's no sweeping, score. It's not pretty. It's not like a big level like production horror film. It's like it's trying still to continue to perpetuate the idea that this is real. And there wasn't a lot of bells and whistles. We're just showing you what happened to these kids.
Or the documentarian style, I guess, isn't it? It's because the whole concept is that you're watching footage of something, and that it's almost like it. I've always felt it's like the audience are part of a police department. They're an investigation in a way. It's almost like they took that, and the Curse of the Blair Witch sort of it perpetuates this in a way, because it's talking about how they put this footage together. Essentially, the idea is that the police put this footage together and they edit it together. It's not Heather. It's the police who put it all together, and then it's presented. So it almost includes the audience in that sense of there's something a little bit unsettling and leery about that. The idea that maybe, I quite like the idea that this was leaked, that this is a police thing that was leaked. And then, and it's got out to the masses. There's something quite creepy about that idea, really. And it was, and like I say, it was perpetuated in this external marketing and things like that. But I think that adds to the level of terror, really, and horror, especially when you find those things out.
It's also a nice get out of jail free card for the filmmakers. If anybody's like, oh, this part's really dragging, or why is this included?
Yeah, well, it was a police guy who did it. He's no filmmaker. He's no filmmaker, detective, whatever. Yeah, I like that.
I think the opening also creates, because there's some expectation. If you'd seen the documentary, you're going into it with these preconceived notions, and so you're waiting for something to happen. And if you've never seen the documentary and you just kind of came to see the film with some vague idea of what it is, like, you're waiting for that sting, you're waiting for that opening something, and instead you just get the Blair Witch Project followed by the card with the, in October 1994 3 people disappeared, and the whole time, I mean, you're engaged with it, but you're also like waiting for something to happen, so it kind of builds this little bit of electricity.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. I would have loved to have been one of those people who watched The Curse of the Blair Witch first, because I think it came out just before this, didn't it? It came out just before the cinematic release. It was very close.
My memory of it is that, it was it coincided with the release of the film.
Yeah. And and obviously that was intentional to partly build up suspense for the movie and build up interest for the movie, but also because that documentary, and we will absolutely do an episode on this eventually, on this minute, definitely on this podcast. But that documentary doesn't tell you what happens to these guys. It doesn't do what the film does. Doesn't show you. It establishes the entire mythology that then the movie makes sense when you watch this. And obviously, the movie is good in the sense that it lays out a lot of the basic things you need to know for the ending to make sense. It does that at the beginning. But if you watch The Curse of the Blair Witch, it adds so much more to the myth and the legend and the explanations as to why, the things like Rustin Parr happened and all that kind of stuff. It's brilliant. And so I'd love to have had that experience, because I watched the documentary afterwards. And, you said in the last minute, Mike, that the documentary's better. I think it's scarier. The documentary freaks me out more than the film, weirdly enough.
Well, there's more information in it, so...
Yeah.
I think... I don't know if this is considered jumping ahead, but I feel like a lot of the air quote problems with the film is its sort of lack of exposition and traditional storytelling. Its ability to communicate some of this information, and we talked about how Myrick and Sanchez were assembling this from material that was shot, and they just had to sort of make their story from what was there. So that's I think why for me the documentary is so much more successful, because they tell you the scary stuff, whereas this one, the film itself, implies the scary stuff.
That's it, isn't it? Yeah, that's the difference. It's a different kind of fear. It's a different kind. Yeah, and that's obviously intentional. The idea of the film is to immerse you in this experience, whereas the documentary is all about filling you with a sense of dread and creepiness and, full of questions and an ominous sense of horror. And that's what I love about it, to be fair. But it uses a lot more tricks. It has that creepy music. It has, lots of a few points where it has more directorial style to it and that kind of thing. So it gives itself more of a basis to do that, whereas the Blair Witch isn't that at all, as we're saying. But it's funny you said, Mike, about how it wasn't doing with this opening, it's not doing what the horror films at the time are doing. What I thought of immediately when you said that? I thought of a film that couldn't be more opposite to this, that came out the same year, which was the Jan de Bont remake of The Haunting.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember that? With like Liam Neeson was in it, and Catherine Zeta-Jones, I think. There was a few people in there.
I do sadly remember it.
It's exactly right. It's not very good. It couldn't be more opposite.
I'm a huge fan of Shirley Jackson's book and the original Wise film. So when that movie came along, I was excited, and then it was it was more. It was style over substance.
Absolutely.
I mean, the original Haunting played more on mood, much like the Blair Witch, and the film that Jan de Bont put out was loud and colorful and visual, and it's like that's not the Haunting.
But it sort of establishes that the kind of place I think that horror was in.
Yeah.
Largely before Blair Witch, you've either got these big kind of horror spectacular. You've got some trashy sort of continuations of, franchises past, whether it's, pretty rubbish Halloween sequels or Hellraiser sequels and things like that. Or you've got the postmodern Scream stuff that's going on. There's nothing wrong with Scream. Scream, particularly for the first Scream. And I would argue, Mike, that I quite like Scream 3 as well, which came out not long after Blair Witch. I'm probably on my own there, but I quite like that one.
You got a friend there.
Cool.
I also really dig 4.
See, I didn't love 4, but I'm going to go and rewatch 4 before 5 comes out, which is obviously in production. So yeah, I'm missing something there, I think, aren't I? But I think that Scream, Scream's great, but it was doing different things. Whereas, the Blair Witch comes along and it completely transforms what you expect and then from then on you start getting more of these, these projects that sort of dig in and unsettle you in the way that the Blair Witch does. And I think, it just strikes me that there couldn't be more of a difference, really.
Blair Witch has no artifice. It does manipulate its audience, but it manipulates its audience with completely different tools. And I think that's one of the reasons why people reacted to it the way they did, because usually if you could be shown something that you're either not used to seeing or you've never seen before, like you go into horror movies expecting certain things, like you were saying, and this was very, very different. And
a lot of that's down to, as you say, the directors and the producers involved, particularly Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick, who co-directed the film, and a big influence was also Greg Hale, who's one of the producers, as well as Robin Cowie and Michael Manello, and they're essentially the group that founded Haxan Films, which is what we mentioned as one of the logos. And it's interesting hearing them talk about where they got that from as well, Mike, isn't it? The actual word Haxan, which has a really old basis of a Swedish-Danish silent film.
1922,
1922, yeah. So this is around the era of Dr. Caligari and that kind of stuff.
Have you seen Haxan?
Have you ever... No, have you?
It's amazing.
I'm very curious to see it. Oh, is it? Cool. Okay.
The imagery in it is like, how were they doing this in 1922?
Really? Wow.
It's crazy. It's very like it's kind of a documentarian style of talking about the history of witchcraft and whatnot. And
right. Yeah.
I caught the Haxan reference. Now I have it in my notes. I was going to bring it up as well, but thinking back on it now, I feel like there's distant cousins here, in a way.
Absolutely, yeah. I haven't read a lot about. I haven't seen Haxan. I haven't read a lot about it, but yeah, I'm fascinated to go and watch it. Do you know if it's anywhere? Is it on any of the streaming services, or is it a bit more? You got to dig deep.
Well, it is.
Find this, do you know?
There was a beautiful Criterion edition released.
Oh wow!
So
okay.
It's probably on the Criterion channel.
Oh, we don't have that in the UK.
Yeah, we don't have that in Canada either.
Oh right. Oh, okay. Yeah.
But
our pain.
I don't know if it's available on any alternate streaming service. It'd be worth checking out.
I will look for that, and I'd encourage anyone, based on what you've said about it, to go and find it as well, because it obviously, as you say, it has connective tissue, not just about the witch side of things and the fact it's investigating witchcraft, but also the documentarian aspect. So it's a very, very cool name for a production company, actually. So it was really interesting that they chose that, and clearly shows, because they were all film students, these guys, and they all, they met through the University of Central Florida film program. So they've all got a knowledge of film history. And there was a good story about how they were they were at a screening for Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, which is, one of the Freddy Krueger films. And it was just a bit of a comedy romp. And they did an after conversation with people, and they were all saying, where have all the scary films gone? Where are the things like The Exorcist? Where's The Shining? The Changeling, the kind of films that creeped us out as kids. Where are they? Why aren't they getting made anymore? And this was around 1991, and this was around the point that they started thinking about Blair Witch, and they based actually a lot of it on The Legend of Boggy Creek, which was a 72 film that was supposedly documenting a Bigfoot creature in rural Arkansas, which I don't, is that, you might know this, Mike, I'm not sure, is that the famous Bigfoot footage? Is that where that comes from?
I'm not sure. That I don't know.
I don't know. I need to look that up, actually. I need to go into more depth, because the classic footage of the Bigfoot looking at the camera, which I'm sure everybody has seen. But it was partly that, and also the Leonard Nimoy hosted series In Search Of, which was throughout the 70s, and they was talking about UFOs and ESP and all that kind of thing. So they had these kind of, documentarian or faux documentarian things in their mind, coupled with the idea that these kind of creeping horror films that get under your skin aren't really happening anymore. They're not being made. Everything's either postmodern, or it's camp, or it's glossy. And that fueled part of their, reason to try and make something that would just unsettle you and get under your skin. So I think it shows. I think even though, it's weird, isn't it, Mike? Even though this film isn't particularly artistic in a way, I think the knowledge of artistry that they have is quite telling in the way they make it.
It's interesting to, film cinephiles would recognize just right off the bat from Haxan Films that, that's their street cred right there. But the general public it would just be like another logo going by, and they wouldn't even realize, its connection to witches and whatnot. But you actually kind of reminded me, talking about just the overall vibe of where horror was, and you mentioned In Search Of, and I remember part of my entry into another thing you're familiar with, the X-Files. Yeah. There used to be a lot of things like In Search Of, things, little documentary shows that would talk about, very much like The Curse of the Blair Witch. They would be these specials that would come on, and they would tell you about these things that happened, these mysteries, these unsolved, supernatural whatevers. And because of the general lack of the internet, at least in the way that we know it now, and the way, maybe a little bit of ignorance to sort of filmmaking processes and stuff, and also maybe because I was a little bit younger, those things had a lot more impact on me and spurred a lot of my imagination and sent me into places like the X-Files and looking for sort of the weird things like the Blair Witch, because it was easier to get sucked into that. And we talked about how the Blair Witch is sort of it's on the fence of a cultural sort of shift, because when we went into the millennium, I mean, the much talked about 9/11 happened, and the way that the ideas towards, government and conspiracies and whatever shifted. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this, other than to just say that there was kind of a culture and a mindset that I think was waning. It was you mentioned the meta sort of approach to Scream. I'm really curious how this movie would have felt coming out just a few years later. And I think we have a small picture of that with Adam Wingard's film. But it was just so perfectly placed in cinema history, in cultural history. I think it kind of had to happen when it happened. And you also, you talked about the Blair Witch experience, and that's kind of how I view the film. I don't really view the film as a film anymore, because there are so many secondary and tertiary parts to it that are part of that experience. And I mean, it depends on how deep you want to go. There was comic books, there was games, there is a mythology that's just barely scratched at on the surface in the film.
Those games were really cool, actually, yeah. There were 3 games, and weren't there? I think one was set in the 40s, where you were investigating the Rustin Park crimes. One was set in 1780s or whatever, and it was where Ellie Kedwood was happening. It was fascinating. There was lots of, there was some real, and there's always been talk about, I think in fact they are making a Blair Witch game, another one. There's always been talk about these things these immersive kind of experiences, like you say, that go beyond. And I kind of, in a way, much as the second Blair Witch film I really enjoyed, and Book of Shadows, which does something different, I almost like the fact that the mythology of Blair Witch is still mysterious. I almost like the fact it hasn't quite been done to death, in a way. And I kind of want it to remain that way. I don't want there to be the prequel novel where you see what happens in Blair, in 1780, whatever. I don't want to know. I would rather have the mystery. And I think that's part of, why... because I think you're absolutely right in what you're saying. It came at the end of a decade that had been fueled by conspiracy theory. It had been fueled by this resurgence in shows like The X-Files, like things like Unsolved Mysteries, in the late 80s and 90s with Robert Stack, which was a favourite of mine when I was a kid growing up, because that terrified me, that show. And it's just come back, hasn't it, on Netflix now.
That theme song was creepy.
It was terrifying, yeah, wasn't it? I know, really scary. And then the whole thing, even though a lot of those crimes, a lot of those mysteries weren't things like, witches and demons and, UFOs, it was usually people who'd killed someone and was trying to hide it. It still was scary, whereas now, watching it now as an adult, it's not quite the same. Although watching it now, it just loses something. Back then, there was another show that was a bit like In Search Of that we had in the UK called Strange But True, which was very similar to that Leonard Nimoy-styled show. It was a guy who would come on and tell these creepy stories, and there were a few that really stuck with me. There's one about a couple in France who went on a journey, went on a holiday, driving holiday, stayed at a hotel while they were driving down France, which was a bit old-fashioned and weird, and then they drove to France, went on their holiday, came back looking for that hotel, and it wasn't there. And then they found out later on that there was a hotel there 100 years ago, and it burned down. And that's apparently true. That actually happened. And so, it's little things like that stuck with me as a kid. And I was like, ooh, that's creepy.
That's
creepy
a fantastic story.
Yes. Oh, it's so good. I need to find it on YouTube, actually, and see if I can dig out that episode, because it terrified me, it freaked me out as a kid, because I just then start imagining everything. And I imagine what it must have been like for those people. And in a way, it sort of makes sense in context of Blair Witch, because it was a bunch of people who were going off the beaten track in rural France and staying somewhere that probably was like a haunted... It was a bit like the house in Blair Witch, at the end, that spectrally appeared and disappeared. Or something like that. It was just a really creepy tale that really gets under your skin, like an urban myth. And I think that's why Blair Witch was really successful, because it played off the back of that, just at the point where people's interest in that was maybe starting to wane. And then, as you say, when 9/11 happened, it kicked off a whole other raft of conspiracy theory that changed the way cinema worked. And I think there would have been more cynicism around Blair Witch in a way, were it made after that point, as it was then. I don't know. I think there's something about the placement of it. I think you're spot on. I think it's absolutely right. But yeah, I think it's very interesting to think about the context of when it was made and why they made it. Really,
this might be like a tenuous connection, but I've also always sort of, because it's an independent film that made a ridiculous profit off of its original budget, it always reminds me of John Carpenter's Halloween, which is another film that came at the end of a decade. And it was another film that didn't necessarily pioneer a subgenre or a style, because I think Black Christmas came before it and sort of started like that slasher genre. But it was another movie that was made on a low budget with a filmmaker that had a vision, made ridiculous amounts of money, and started a whole trend, because after that it was Friday the 13th, it was My Bloody Valentine, it was like, it just goes on and on. Freddy, and this film was just kind of like perfectly positioned as well, kind of 20 years later, doing sort of the same thing. It kind of feels like this spiritual sequel in a way.
I think that's it. It comes off the back of those kind of things, but takes it into a different realm where it's like you say, it's more immediately sort of experiential. It's like being dropped in the middle of something that you're meant to. It's more immersive in a sense than some of those films had actually been, because it's less. Because the whole nature of it is that there's not a traditional script. It's improvised. The direction of it is very unusual. So yeah, but there is definitely DNA there. Absolutely.
We didn't really talk about the wording of the card that comes up, sort of telling the story, which is very brief. It's very sparse, and I find it interesting. Again, just kind of feeding in a little bit into the experiential sort of aspect of it, and learning about. The filmmaker said in the commentary that they argued extensively about the wording of those 5 sentences,
something like that. Yeah,
and I mean, to me, it's perfect. It sums it up perfectly. Yeah. But you look at it and you just figure somebody whipped that off. Well, what are we going to put here? Basic elevator pitch for the movie, and to find out how much they kind of discussed it and argued about it, it's just kind of another reveal to the filmmaking of it, like the work that actually went into it, and that idea we talked about earlier about how I think a lot of people look at found footage and they figure that this is something that people literally put together in like 20 minutes, on their computer and then release, and how much work it actually is to keep that idea of the reality and to not push it too far, the tightrope that I mentioned, that you're kind of always walking with it. And it's such a simple thing, and it has a lot of stuff sort of happening behind the scenes to make it happen that you only find out if you kind of explore it. But
yeah, there's also a lot. I always feel like there's a lot between the spaces in those words. In that, it's, if you read them, ostensibly it tells you, this is what you're watching, basically. But the whole idea of a year later their footage was found then leads you to ask all kinds of questions.
Yeah,
like, where was it found? How was it found? Why are we watching it? Like, what? How? And you don't know that unless you watch The Curse of the Blair Witch, and that tells you how it was found, which is weird in itself. How that all works. It's another mystery in itself, but it gives you more detail. And then Book of Shadows very much uses that as a jumping off point, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's fascinating. In that you get a deeper sense of a world beyond what you're going to watch here, and I think, especially once you've watched the film, that really becomes apparent. So the way, like you say, the way they've chosen that is far more carefully put together than you would realise, because it adds to the sense of expectation of what the hell are we going to watch? Like, what is coming? It's a brilliant way to start the movie. Definitely, it's far more effective than just starting with Heather, and seeing Heather, that blurry shot. Having that just forebodes the whole thing.
I never thought about it. Brilliant. You just introduced the idea into my head. If they had literally just started it without even credits, or without even the title card, if it just started on Heather, what kind of an experience that would have been? Where you're just dropped into it.
Yeah, that's true. And you didn't have any. Yeah, and you didn't know they'd gone missing. Can you imagine that? Like, you think, oh, okay, this is a nice story about some students and that kind of thing. Whoa! That would have been a whole different film, definitely, but it would have been really interesting.
Yeah, not too shabby for a low-key minute.
Yeah, we found plenty to talk about. It's pretty good. It just proves this film's going to be a bit of a treasure trove, I think. But yeah, we'll be back for minute 2 very soon as we roll on to the next minute. But remember, you can find us at Blair Witch Minute, and we're part of the We Made This podcast network, and we're talking about more than just the Blair Witch Project, so we'll give you a little sneak peek at what else is on the network. But thanks again for listening. So until next time, just remember, stay out of the woods. Elsewhere on We Made This. Cine Mortuary podcast.
Right, Rob, just to laser align and realign the topic of discussion.
Yes.
Would you like to take a dive straight in to the X-Files movie for me, please?
Yes, I would. We open on Gillian Anderson in her lingerie. No, sorry, that's the fan fiction one, isn't it, that people keep talking about?
That you wrote, yeah.
I did not write, and I will sue you, sir. Right, yes, Sounds of the Lambs. Directed by Jonathan Demme, 1991.
Pretty Fly, a 90s nostalgia podcast.
I think it says a lot about our humanity if we go down that road with Hannibal Lecter, and if we kind of, like right at the end of Silence of the Lambs, he's going to have an old friend for dinner. And which is a great line, by the way.
Tremendous line.
It's a movie full of great lines.
Have
Those
an old
sentences.
friend for dinner.
But like, you're kind of happy for him, aren't you? Like I am.
A little bit. I think it's important to remember that even someone who's a psychopath who doesn't have, or a character that's a psychopath that doesn't have that normal range of human emotions, they are human.
Observing the Pattern, a Fringe podcast.
Why is Nina so invested in getting Tyler back? Because, I mean, she even offers to put up the money. Like, oh, Massive Dynamic will cover the ransom. So, like, she's heavily invested. And then, him basically saying, yeah, I took work home with me. And so it kind of, something doesn't add up in that area.
Nina's a very intriguing character because, at least up until this point, and probably well into season 2, you are never sure of her allegiances.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.